Hello, my name is Jake Douglas, and this is Business 250, Principles of Economics. We're going to get into Chapter 4 today, Market Efficiency, Market Failure, and Government. So markets are everywhere. Tokyo fish markets sell tuna fish that weigh over 400 pounds each. Holland in the Netherlands sells millions of flowers that ship to everywhere in the world. In New York, the New York Stock Exchange handles millions of stock trades every day. So these are massive markets, but there are many more smaller markets around the globe. With the introduction of internet access, virtual markets now dominate many countries. From the previous chapters, we understand that every economy has trade-offs and a limited amount of resources. We also understand supply and demand and how they work together to find the right amount of product to sell to consumers and achieve equilibrium. The chapters we've reviewed have covered basic markets. These markets have a lot of buyers and sellers, one or two products, and don't consider a lot of factors when trying to find an efficient market. So in this chapter, we're going to get into the complexities of markets. Not all markets are truly competitive, where dozens of competitors are trying to beat each other for customers. Some markets are much smaller, with few competitors, and actually need rules, usually from governments, to achieve the best results for everyone. One lone person or government official cannot create an efficient market. Think of all the information you need to understand to come to a decision on a product. So if you remember in Chapter 2 when we asked our three basic economic questions, what's going to be made, how are we going to make it, and who's going to get it? The idea that only one person or government agency can decide how to create a market isn't a great foundation for an economy. The Soviet Union is a good example of markets trying to be created and ran by a single entity. The Soviet Union was a country that was dismantled in 1991 and turned into 15 smaller countries, and this includes present-day Russia. In the end, the country fell due to a very weak military and economy, but between 1920 and 1990, the Soviet Union went toe-to-toe with the United States for economic and military power. The country was opposed to the United States free market economy and capitalism in general. Their overall economic model was based on government control of all markets in their country. This included issuing directives on how markets would flow, setting social and economic targets, instituting heavy regulations and controls on what could and could not be produced, and who would make those products. So all social and economic activities were controlled by the government, not its citizens. The Soviet Union people and citizens believed their government when it told them that they alone had the knowledge to direct them to overtake any other economy in the world. So the Soviet Union, also called the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had great economic success in its early days. Up until the 1960s, the country adopted Western technology and used it for their own means. So this rapidly modernized and industrialized the country, and that growth propelled the Soviet Union to a global power. Essentially, the country did little innovation of its own during its existence, using the technology of other global powers to come up in the world, which isn't necessarily a bad thing at the start. But once they caught up to other major powers economically, the country's growth stagnated. Why? Because the government controlled all aspects of the economy and was not good at it. The government stopped innovating and they stopped competing. The governing party of the Soviet Union at the time dictated the levels of production of all goods and decided the prices for all products and services in the country. Think about present times. Do you want an iPhone? Too bad, the government says you get a Samsung. How about some Swiss chocolate? Well, not if the government decides that they're no longer going to import chocolate from Switzerland, and they're no longer going to offer it in its stores. The industries in this country were not owned by private citizens, but rather the government. This is the complete opposite of the United States free market economy, where private citizens own the land and the capital to make products. The Soviet Union owned the land and the capital, set the prices, set how much to make, and prohibited competition. The private sector did not exist. So think of this type of economy as overbearing parents who always decide what's best for you. So this economy failed for two main reasons. One, incentive. There is no incentive to become more efficient in this type of economy. Since the government controlled all aspects of the economy, all the other factors of government were exaggerated. The politics and the power struggles within the government spilled over into their economy, and bad decisions were made. There was no reason to produce excellence or improve products. The government did whatever it felt was adequate with no competition. Secondly, there was no supply and demand within the Soviet Union economy. There were very few decision makers, and they had a general idea of the basic necessities of human needs, but outside of that, they had no guidance on what consumers wanted. Why? Because the government decided what they wanted. Imagine a small group of decision makers trying to understand the and meet the needs of millions of citizens across thousands of miles of land. It just doesn't work. So this led to inefficient industries, and the overall Soviet Union economy began to crumble. Many areas of the USSR began to declare independence from the government. The Soviet military was spread too thin to put down the rebellions, and ultimately the USSR had to capitulate to allow these regions to become independent until the entire Union was dismantled in 1991. So we have 5 keys to efficient markets, and they are information being widely available, property rights being protected, private contracts being enforced, spillovers from other actors are limited, and competition prevailing. Buyers like accurate information so they can make good decisions when they buy something and not feel ripped off or dissatisfied after their purchase. Sellers need adequate information to understand who the people are that want to buy from them and where they live so they can sell it to them. That's just a couple of examples. So good information leads to good transactions where everyone is happy. Property rights really define a free market and an efficient economy. The quote in this slide is from Hernando de Soto, a Spanish explorer from Spain in the 1500s, and he was talking about his exploration of South and North America during that time and what he observed from the cultures in his travels. My interpretation of this quote is not necessarily he thought those cultures were behaving wrongly, but rather he was expressing frustration and confusion about what rights the people of those cultures truly had. So think about owning a car. Your car has a car title, which is a piece of paper that says you own it. Unless you have a loan on the car, then your bank more or less says that they own it. So what if you had a car and you had zero documentation that says you own it? What about a house that you buy? Would you feel comfortable if there was zero evidence that your house is truly yours outside of just telling everyone to stay back because you swear you own it? Even buying something from Walmart gives you a receipt that you bought your items with your money and now those items are yours. What if you didn't get a receipt? The Walmart greeters would try and shake everyone down, not just the ones walking out with TVs. So I give these examples because without truly owning property and resources, you don't have assets. If you don't have provable assets that you can use as capital, then you can't obtain loans or sell those assets later. So think of personal property rights as formalizing ownership, making it official that you own something. Many developing countries don't have the level of property rights we do in the United States, and that usually leads to informal mechanisms being put in place that make transactions between buyers and sellers very difficult or not possible at all. I mean, would you trust someone that wants to sell you a house if they have no record that they own it to begin with? If we own stuff, it gives us an incentive to use what we own more efficiently. Don't think of a legal system strictly on whether people and businesses commit crimes and go to prison. It's much broader than that. So having a legal system with protections for buyers and sellers keeps everyone honest with each other and curbs dishonesty and cheating. So this works if it's enforced. You can't just have a well thought out criminal or civil court system and then never go after the bad people or businesses when they do bad things. Governments have to enforce those laws also. And much like property rights, we have legal instruments, which is another word for documents, that lay out who owns what transactions are happening, and what can happen if one side does not hold up their end of the bargain, like taking out a loan and then not paying the money back. So if an agreement goes south and one side doesn't uphold their end of the bargain, we need a legal system to enforce the agreement. Said another way, an efficient economy doesn't hurt third parties when transactions happen. A good example of a third party being affected by a transaction would be pollution. The more that a transaction only affects the buyer and seller and not third parties, the more efficient that market is. And third parties can be other people, water, air, animals, plants, anything that could be negatively affected, whether it be unintentionally or intentionally. Competition prevailing. So competition between many buyers and sellers gives us hundreds, millions, billions of transactions that set benchmarks for market prices. If we don't have all this competition, then a transaction boils down to one-on-one encounters and whatever value each side agrees upon at the time. There's nothing out there to compare. You can see this when very rare items go up for sale or auction, like a Picasso painting or something where only one or a few of it exists. There is nothing or very little to compare it to, so you can have an idea on how much you'll pay for it. Rich people like art, so they pay millions for it, and the rest of us are thinking of all the really cool things we'd buy with $1 million instead of a painting. So see how that type of market can be confusing when there is no history or comparison to a product. Market discipline. Markets impose discipline on consumers and producers. Sellers would like to get away with charging higher prices while producing shoddier goods so that they can earn greater profits. They don't, because their businesses will fail if they do that. Manufacturers don't make quality products because it feels good, they do it for their survival. As for buyers like us, we want to drive nice cars, wear great clothes, and travel wherever we want to. For rich consumers, that's commonplace, but for the majority of us, it's not, and we have to choose some things and give up others, if you remember the term opportunity cost from a previous chapter. So rationing is individuals deciding which products are most important to us. This is different than opportunity cost, which is what we are giving up to get what we want. Rationing is simply the decision-making process of choosing what we buy. Rationing is a term that can also be used to describe giving people only a fixed amount, and that happens during times of major wars in America and during pandemics. You may recall that during our worst years of coronavirus, stores were allowing customers only a fixed amount of certain things like toilet paper. But in the terms of this class and in economics, know that rationing is a person's decision on what to buy. If a product is expensive, that means consumers value a product highly. Rational businesses do not set prices on products that are so high that no one will buy them. If they do, they fail. A business may offer a new product extremely high and may lower it if demand is also low. If the business is smart, they'll adjust their price so people will finally buy their product. iPhones are usually over $1,000 because people will buy it at that price. They value it. High price leads to higher profits for firms. Other potential firms see this and they want in too. When they come in, supply increases. When supply increases, prices eventually go down. Competition makes all of this work. So we know from prior reading that markets determine an equilibrium price for a product. Markets also determine how much a producer will make of something. But consumers and producers also receive an additional benefit that is called consumer and producer surplus. So knowing consumer and producer surplus can tell an economist how well a market is doing. So let's look at consumer surplus first. Consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer pays for an item and what they would have been willing to pay. It's a benefit to when a buyer is paying less for something that they'd have paid more to begin with. We know that surplus means extra of something, and in the case of consumer producer surplus, it isn't exactly about having extra money, at least, on a large scale like a big market. It's not really about how much you've saved. Rather, it's a measure of the good feeling or additional satisfaction you get from getting a better deal. That sounds really hard to quantify, right? Especially when we've talked about how economics tries to stick to facts and avoids feelings and opinions. The consumer surplus theory suggests that the value of a consumer satisfaction can actually be measured, and there are both large-scale and small-scale equations to measure this. The equations would be consumer surplus equals half times equilibrium quantity times the difference between maximum price minus equilibrium price. And the small scale equation would be consumer plus equaling maximum price minus the market price. All right, so here's our large scale example of measuring consumer surplus as an economist. So let's say that you are a coach and you are buying tickets for your high school football team to a pro football game. So from our graph, we know that the equilibrium is where the supply and demand curve meet. And where do they meet? They meet at 40 tickets for $50 each. 40 is the quantity at equilibrium and $50 is the price at equilibrium. That's currently set by the market for tickets to this game. So from our equation, we now have consumer plus equaling half times 40 times the maximum price minus 50. So now we need to know what the most you are willing to pay for one ticket is, the maximum price. And we look at the top of the supply curve, and it starts at $70. That is the most you would be willing to pay, but just for one ticket. So now we can complete our equation. Consumer surplus equaling half times 40 times 70 minus 50. And with all that math together, we get 400. Our value for consumer surplus for tickets is 400, and higher is better. So a higher value of consumer surplus usually means that whatever you are buying is priced quite a bit lower in the market than what you'd be willing to pay, which is a good thing for consumers, thus consumer surplus. So let's try an easier short scale example. The overall point of a consumer surplus is that if you felt like you got a good deal on something, it can be measured in money terms, but really it's a measure of how happy you felt after the transaction. The smaller scale equation is you buy a plane ticket, your budget's $500. You shop online, you find a ticket for $300. What's the most you would have paid? Maximum price, $500. What's the price you did pay? $300. 500 minus 300 equals 200. Your consumer surplus is $200. Producer surplus is the difference between the market price of a product and the price at which a firm is willing to supply that product. It is also depicted as a triangular area below the demand line, but producer surplus is below the equilibrium market price instead of above it, like consumer surplus. So said another way, is the difference between the price a seller would be willing to accept to sell their products and what the product is worth on the market. The cheapest price that the producer would charge to make something compared to the market price. If the market price goes up, the producer surplus also goes up. In a healthy economy or market, having both a consumer and a producer surplus is good. If both sides feel that they are getting what they want, the market is running efficiently. When we combine consumer surplus and producer surplus, we get what we call economic surplus. For markets to be efficient, they must operate within solid institutional structures, which are the 5 keys to efficient markets that we talked about earlier. But that's tough, and some markets don't meet these requirements. But when not all 5 keys are met, that doesn't mean a market totally fails or collapses. Rather, it means it's not providing the optimal amount of products to consumers. It's simply not running efficiently. Asymmetric information is when one party to a transaction has significantly better information than another party. Remember the information advantages we talked about in Chapter 1. That included politicians knowing about the effects of policy changes before the public does, or insider stock trading. Those are 2 examples of asymmetric information, people who have much better knowledge of a product or service than everyone else. Now, it can happen where buyers know more than sellers. So think of a garage sale. Usually there are antique buyers that show up at garage sales or trade shows and know much more about an item than the seller and make purchases that increase their individual consumer surplus like we just talked about. But more often than not, sellers have superior knowledge than buyers about products. If you try to buy a used car from someone, do you buy it outright with no questions asked, right out of their driveway? No, you know the seller has more knowledge about the car than you do, so you gather information and hope your used car guy is honest about the vehicle. So what happens when sellers consistently have superior knowledge of a product over buyers? The buyers will begin to hesitate on purchasing the product, not knowing if it's a good product or not. If I'm at a car dealership and I can't tell if a car is a good car or if it's a lemon, I'm going to start to assume that all cars are lemons and simply not buy any, and that's not good for sellers. In that particular example, the car market may be failing, but it doesn't collapse. So rather, sellers offer incentives. So for example, a warranty on a used car to protect buyers if the car breaks down quickly. If buyers are provided incentives and protections when they buy a product, then buyers and sellers can overcome the asymmetric information issue. When individual car sellers can't offer warranties, they can keep a detailed record of all the maintenance they kept on the vehicle and car reports on any accidents. That example also allows asymmetric information to be overcome. Now the buyer will be less hesitant to buy the car. Adverse selection is when products of different qualities are sold at the same price and is a type of asymmetric information. And adverse selection is most apparent in the insurance industry. So health insurance, life insurance. In those types of transactions, a person who buys insurance knows much more about their health and lifestyle than the insurance company, even if an insurance company performs a physical on the person before issuing a policy. Insurance companies use advantages to determine how much they will charge its customers. Some people are high risk to have health problems, some are low risk, and insurance companies try to find out the middle ground in between to set their prices. While a lot of people in the United States have some form of health insurance, who do you think needs it the most? The high-risk people, right, and they're more likely to buy insurance than someone who isn't high risk. Therefore, the insurance pool tends to be filled with higher risk individuals. With high-risk individuals comes higher insurance payouts, which could result in the insurance company not being profitable if they set their prices too low. Adverse selection skews the insurance pool with high-risk individuals, giving the industry high risk compared to the social average. So how do insurance companies protect themselves from losing money and going out of business? They offer policies at different prices to different groups. So health insurance companies use deductibles and co-payments to attract low-risk individuals. A deductible means the customer must pay a certain amount of money before insurance even starts covering their costs, such as a $500 deductible or $1,000 deductible in a given year. After you pay your deductible, insurance will start covering some or all of your costs. A copayment, which is different than a deductible, is a small payment the customer makes for each transaction you make, such as a doctor's visit or a prescription. You make a copayment, your insurance covers the rest. So most insurance policies that have deductibles and copayments have a low monthly premium, so this is what attracts low-risk people to obtain health insurance. High-risk people, on the other hand, don't want a high deductible or high copayments because they know they will be paying these in full every year since they'll be at the doctor a lot. So high-risk individuals usually would rather pay a high monthly payment with low deductibles and low copayments, so they're not paying out of pocket so much and their monthly payments cover as many services as possible. So we have one company, multiple products based on average selection. Two policies can both be $200 per month, but based on the individual's health risks, their policies will be very different. Moral hazard occurs when an insurance policy or some other arrangement changes the economic incentives that lead to a change in behavior. Said another way, after a transaction occurs, a buyer or seller's behavior changes based on the transaction. That's the moral hazard. When professional athletes sign contracts for millions of dollars, their contracts usually include clauses that they cannot participate in high-risk activities as long as they are under contract that could physically hurt them. Skydiving, skiing, you name it. The owner of the team is reducing the moral hazards after the contract. Car rental companies know that their customers aren't going to perform routine maintenance on the vehicles they rent, like checking oil, so their rental contracts are for a short period of time, usually a month or less. They avoid the hazard of receiving a car back in bad shape and needing repairs by signing a contract that avoids moral hazards. There are a couple problems with property rights that occur within property rights. One is we have what we call public goods. Public goods are products that once consumed or used by someone, it does not diminish what is left for others. Property rights give people a strong incentive to use what we own wisely. When resources are owned by multiple groups or multiple people, or if property ownership isn't clear, there is an incentive to waste the resource in some way or not take care of it as well. But there are two causes of markets failing due to property rights. Private goods are products that once purchased or consumed preclude anyone else from also enjoying it. Now, that may sound like a negative, but it's a positive for buyers. If you buy one plane ticket, your seat is yours and yours alone. Once you've bought it, no one gets to share it with you. You would not be thrilled sharing one seat with someone on a plane. Your plane ticket is a private good. We are sitting in chairs in your classroom when you have class. Multiple people cannot use your chair without things getting weird. So sharing your chair doesn't give you or anyone else sitting in it the desired experience you want. That's a private good, your chair, in class. Public goods, on the other hand, are products that are once used, do not diminish what is left for others. For example, watching a football game on a TV channel. You watch football, but that doesn't mean there is less football to watch for everyone else. So said another way, public goods are infinitely extendable. You can even be as broad as knowing economics itself. Your knowledge of economics can be shared without any diminishing value to others. We would call that knowledge, which can be considered a public good. Public goods are what we call non-rivalry. So if you use something, it's still available to others. And we also call it non-exclusive. It's impossible to exclude others from something. Private goods are the opposite. They are exclusive and they are rival. But public goods can lead to the free rider problem, which is when once the public product is provided, others can no longer be excluded from using it, and some will consume the product without paying for it. So some will choose to use the product for free, and we call those people free riders. Now, within reason, there is nothing wrong with helping out others use stuff for free. Nonprofit organizations exist from the donations of a few individuals, firms, or groups, and everyone else benefits by whatever the organization offers. Wikipedia is a good example. They ask for donations to keep their website up and running and are supported by donors. The list of public goods can be extensive. Satellites in the air offering GPS and internet, weather forecasts, lighthouses, public broadcasting stations, really any product that benefits everyone while only a few pay for it. So like many other items we've discussed so far in economics, there are good intentions with public goods, but they can have negative effects on the economy to the point that too many public goods can create a market failure. Free riding itself prevents the production and consumption of products and services. Why? because to free riders, they have little to no incentive to contribute to the product or service. They're already enjoying its benefits for free. As a result, the producer or seller of a product cannot be compensated sufficiently. The seller must rely on others to keep up with costs, either from individual donors, the government, or both. The producer needs help to stay afloat. If you're a business owner, how would you feel that if you could only pay your bills from the donations of others? Would you feel comfortable with that business practice? And most of us wouldn't. And most businesses back away from free-to-rider markets because they cannot control their own operations. You, the business owner, would have to ask for help constantly, and that's what we see from Wikipedia and PBS and the like. They're constantly asking for donations, or else they won't exist. Now, some people in communities feel responsible to pay their fair share and have no problem supporting public goods, and that's fine. Anyone who pays taxes contributes to public goods already. But can you imagine if a majority of businesses used free riders? Do you think an economy would survive on this system where most or all businesses are constantly asking you for donations? It would be a mess, and new businesses would not participate. They would go to other markets. The free rider problem may not present any issues initially. However, as costs grow or accumulate, maintaining and continuing to provide a product or service becomes more difficult until ultimately it can no longer be provided at all. The free rider problem can cause overuse, misuse, or deterioration of a product or service and can eventually be a burden on communities if it's not carefully monitored. The second problem with property rights arises from common property resources, which are resources that are owned by a community at large. These types of resources tend to be overexploited because individuals have little incentive to use them sustainably. Because these resources are held in common, each individual or group tends to race to get theirs before others can do the same. A good example of this are ocean fisheries. Global demand for fish has increased as the world population has increased, along with improved technology for boats and fishing equipment. This generally unregulated industry has caused entire species of fish to be fished out. Our book estimates that 90% of all ocean predators are now gone because of this, so think of sharks. As fish populations shrink, the supply shrinks and in turn less fishing businesses. The solution to common property resources and overexploitation is typically assigning property rights to these resources, giving strict ownership, or government regulation to protect the assets. So summarizing property rights. When property rights are clearly defined, people have an incentive to use resources efficiently. When rights are not defined, it leads to waste and inefficiency. Public goods and common property resources are two problems that arise when property rights are not used correctly. Governments should protect resources when the private market cannot. Let's talk about external costs. External costs occur when a transaction has an impact on a third party not involved in the transaction and are always a negative for the third party. When external costs are present in a market, the market itself rarely produces the optimal amount of goods and services to the economy, meaning equilibrium cannot be reached easily. An example, like we talked about earlier, is pollution, but know that external costs can come from both making a product or consuming a product. If you're a buyer, think about all the trash you create at home. So let's assume a company that makes cleaning products creates unhealthy water in the local economy. The cleanup or other additional measures to fix the pollution increase the cost of the manufacturer. With those increased costs, if we look at a supply curve, the supply will decrease, and we know that is a shift to the left on the demand curve. In the graph we see on the slide, we have two supply curves. If the producers were left to their own devices, or if consumers did not care about any external costs, we will get what we call the private cost curve. The social cost curve is the supply offered to the markets when the producers have to consider their external costs and they have to pay for them, like pollution. So just looking at these two curves, we think, hey, on the private cost curve, there is more quantity of products at a lower price, and that's really good. But we know third parties and larger society will be affected by ignoring those external costs. So the market follows the social cost curve to cover those external costs. But now that means higher prices and less quantity of products. And that's not ideal for a market and can lead to market failure. If a market goes unregulated, which is what our marginal private cost curve shows, producers are making too much of a product at too low of a price, and third parties will deal with those negative consequences. So in the graph shown, the social curve is the optimal curve for the market, when a market is faced with external costs, so third parties are not negatively affected. But we'd actually have a better market if there were no external costs at all. On the flip side, we have external benefits. These benefits occur when a transaction has a positive impact on a third party that isn't involved in the transaction. An example would be the college education you're receiving currently. The education you receive will benefit not only you, but society in general after you graduate. So think about a doctor graduating school who can now treat patients. Another example is you deciding to take your bike to work or use public transportation. Well, that sounds silly, but if you do that, that is one less car on the road that can disrupt traffic or cause congestion, and you create a bit less pollution in the air for society. That choice gave an external benefit to society. And that all sounds great because it is a positive, but external benefits can also lead to market failure. Why? Because in a free market, there is no incentive for an individual to take into consideration this external benefit. External benefits are a good thing, but a free market doesn't really promote this very well. So if external benefits are not promoted enough, this could cause a market to stagnate or degrade over time. So how do governments or agencies promote external benefits? Well, they usually do that with subsidies, such as helping pay for your education so that you have an incentive to go get a degree. External benefits are good, but a free market usually produces too little of these types of products and needs to incentivize individuals to invest in them. So the main takeaway from external costs and external benefits are that external costs should be avoided in markets and external benefits should be promoted, both to improve a market or at least prevent it from slowing or failing. Competitive markets do not always prevail. In theory, a market left to itself should always be competitive. In reality, the government sometimes needs to promote competition to maximize efficiency in a market. In cases of markets failing, again, don't think of it as a market completely collapsing. Instead, think of market failure as a market being inefficient and needing correction. So let's do a short history lesson of United States economics. So far we've studied how markets work, why they're efficient, and reasons that they aren't. But economics isn't all about terms and definitions. It's also about understanding how we have the markets of today and why government institutions exist that control economies. So with that said, let's go over the history of the United States economy, starting shortly after the American Civil War. The era of industrialization was characterized by a lot of growth and very little government intervention. In only a 4-year period from 1861 to 1865, the total number of U.S. manufacturers doubled and total output of products tripled during the Civil War. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, which connected the east and west coasts of the United States. In that time frame, rail mileage, train rails, increased sixfold, and freight tonnage increased 30-fold. So this huge growth of the railroads created problems, and that was mostly due to lack of competition. No local competition meant the few players in the railroad market charged high prices, and they were too high. So because of that, U.S. Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission, or ICC, to regulate the railroads. Oil, steel, mining, agriculture, these industries also grew rapidly. But these growing industries were not regulated well, and ultimately a few firms grew massive and drove away competition. These huge businesses bought out all the competition, and in doing so, the benefits of competition were lost. So because of this, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 that broke up these huge companies to bring back competition. At around the same time, in the late 1800s, labor unions were beginning to develop to protect workers in these industries. However, the legal system at the time pushed back heavily on worker interests. Up until the late 1800s, unions were usually just small guilds of local craftsmen. The industrial era changed that as hundreds of thousands of workers started to unionize due to low pay and unsafe working conditions. After the Great Depression in the 1930s, unions gradually won the right to bargain with the businesses they worked for. Businesses were now required to negotiate with unions. By 1950, unions represented about 1/3 of all United States workers. As industries grew, living standards also grew, and this made consumers have more say in what they wanted from businesses. One of the business owners who understood what consumers wanted was Henry Ford, who brought affordable cars to the market because that's what buyers wanted. And his company, Ford Motor Company, lives on to this day. Banks were not well regulated in the 1800s, and banks went out of business regularly, no different than a restaurant. After two investors attempted to corner the copper market in 1907, the U.S. market collapsed. These two investors attempted to monopolize the copper market with their investments, but they failed, which created huge financial losses to all the banks that associated with these two investors. In those banks, depositors moved their money to other banks that were more reliable. So this snowballed into depositors withdrawing funds to any firm or business associated with the failed monopolization of copper. So one banker, J.P. Morgan, was able to convince other investors to offer loans to these failed banks to prevent them from going out of business. The failed banks had no money to operate. All their depositors withdrew their money. So this centralization of banks helped out the industry in what led to the Federal Reserve being created, which does exactly that. The Federal Reserve sets a standard of regulations that every bank in America now follows. The assassination of a duke in Europe started World War I in 1914, which brought almost every nation on that continent to war, resulting in over 10 million casualties. At the time, Europe was seen as the center of Western culture, but during the war, the U.S. became an economic and financial powerhouse and eventual leader of the free world. However, in the 1920s, the stock market grew 5 times faster than the United States economy, eventually crashing in 1929. 90% of the wealth in the stock market was wiped out in America, and we call that time the Great Depression. So how does the stock market crash an economy? Well, investors were using margin calls to buy stock, where they could only put 10% down and borrow the other 90% to buy a stock. Well, when a stock price falls, investors still had to come up with the 90% that they borrowed to cover their losses. Investors could no longer come up with the money. Stocks go down in price, investors lose their savings, and they can't pay back their creditors. Everyone's losing. So investors thought that putting more market into the stock market would correct it, and it did not, and investors ran out of money, so their accounts were also reduced to zero. So 3 years after the stock market crash in 1929, 25% of workers in the United States were unemployed. 10,000 banks had also failed and closed. So was government intervention the answer? Well, not initially. In 1930, Congress passed tariffs on imported products from other countries, increasing the prices of those products by 60%. Well, in turn, other countries imposed their own tariffs on U.S. products, and this hurt world economies. Secondly, the Federal Reserve tightened credit that banks could use to issue loans. With no credit to issue new loans, banks needed money. So they told homeowners that their loans were now due immediately. Why? Because the banks needed money now. What else did government intervention do? Congress also increased taxes on U.S. citizens to balance the U.S. budget. The government needed money too. So now we have unemployed citizens with zero income, and those that did have jobs had income taken from them to pay more taxes. And so 3 things done by the U.S. government did not help the overall economy during the Great Depression. Tariffs on imported goods, the Federal Reserve tightening up on banks, making it harder for banks to operate, and Congress raising taxes on all working Americans. So how does it get better? Surprisingly, further government intervention to fix what they'd already done. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt became president and promised America a New Deal and chose Francis Perkins as his Secretary of Labor. And together they were able to enact legislation that protected depositor funds in banks so customers would not lose them, provided national aid to states for unemployment benefits to workers, created the federal minimum wage, and they created Social Security. So effectively, Roosevelt created unemployment benefits to unemployed workers, the FDIC that protected a certain amount of money when an individual deposits money at their bank, no one can take it from them, and Social Security benefits that we know provides money to retired workers and people with disabilities. And all these things are still ongoing today. So what else happened? Legislation was passed that further regulated banking, power companies, agriculture, mortgages, and railroads, all meant to protect consumers. Legislation was also passed to build more than 100,000 schools, post offices, public buildings, more railroads, 600 airports, and 10,000 bridges. So with all these actions, America started to financially recover as consumers started to work again and they had protections with their incomes. In 1940, unemployment in the U.S. was still at 15%, but once America got involved in World War II, unemployment dropped under 2% as we started to build armaments for our military and other nations. Gross domestic product doubled in 5 years, almost entirely from creating military armaments. And with that, the Great Depression was essentially over, and the manufacturing infrastructure, buildings and equipment, made for the military during those years was turned into civilian production after the war. They were able to take those military factories and turn them into civilian factories after the war was over. World War II was devastating for Europe. However, the U.S. economy was strengthened from it. Normal goods and services were in short supply, like groceries and fuel, and to prevent these things from becoming too expensive, the U.S. government rationed goods to citizens and put in price controls. And we remember from our case study a couple chapters ago what rent control does to things. In 1944, America and 43 other countries created the International Money Fund to finance world trade and get European countries back on their feet. Many economists expected the U.S. economy to suffer after World War II. In fact, it did the opposite. Why? Pent-up demand, really. Consumers were ready to buy again, and they did. Cars, houses, appliances. The market exploded. This economic boom created an American middle class that we have today. But just like today, it started to become apparent that not every citizen in America was sharing these economic benefits. So after the Great Depression, economists developed a new theory based on macroeconomics, big picture, and this came from an economist named John Maynard Keynes. His idea was called fiscal policy, or using taxing and spending to affect the economy. So what that means is when the economy was headed towards a recession or depression, the government would immediately step in to spend more, reduce taxes, or stimulate the economy in some way to fix it. So put another way, when the economy was not doing well, the government would spend and run an intentional deficit. When the economy was doing well, the government would not spend and run a surplus of money. They would save it more or less. And that is the Keynesian idea of economics. President John F. Kennedy used Keynesian economics as his economic policy. He cut taxes and expanded government programs to grow the economy in the early 1960s. Balancing the budget was no longer a priority of the United States government. Deficits were no longer a concern. The government would simply react to the economy as it happened. Economic growth was now the priority in the 1960s, but it came with a problem, and that was inflation. Demand for products went up, and producers could not keep up. So prices went up as supply went up. As prices went up, so did wages to maintain living costs. The problem is this happened way too fast, and many citizens struggled with cost of living. This in turn caused poverty to rise in America. Many citizens became poor because they could no longer afford a decent standard of living. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, President Lyndon Johnson promised to fix poverty, and he created Medicare, which is medical care to the elderly, Medicaid, which is medical care to the poor, agencies for the transportation, housing, education, and employment sectors to regulate these industries, and legislation to reduce pollution, improve rivers, and make loans easier to understand. So just in those last few slides, we can see that the government got really involved in the American economy with regulations and agencies enforcing them. And while Johnson's policies helped with poverty, it didn't fix the inflation problem, and unemployment was still high. Economists in the 1970s were not confident in a healthy economy in the future. Richard Nixon becomes president, and in 1971 tries to deal with unemployment and inflation with, again, we've heard it before, wage controls and price controls. So these price controls gave a terrible result, and the economy did no better, and those price and wage controls were removed in 1974. The U.S. government by this point had went too far in intervening in the economy, and U.S. citizens were getting tired of the government regulation. So in 1978, then President Jimmy Carter did some things. He deregulated railroads, airlines, and trucking industries to stimulate growth. Well, these deregulations didn't really work either. So ultimately, in the 1960s and 70s, they were known for rising U.S. government intervention, including overbearing regulations, high spending, and high taxes. Americans were starting to put together that high inflation and unemployment was not the fault of free markets, rather is because of their own government and their intervention. So now what? 1981, President Ronald Reagan comes into office. At that time, inflation was at 14% and going up. Unemployment was at 7% and going up. A home loan interest rate was 15%, and the economy was not growing but shrinking. So Reagan understood that government was a problem. So he wanted to do the following. He wanted to reduce income taxes, cut regulations on industries, reduce federal spending everywhere, and get more supply in the economic system. This was the exact opposite of the Keynesian idea. Remember, with that idea, government would spend more when the economy was struggling. Going back a bit, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty reduced the number of families living in poverty by half, which was good. But politically, many thought that America was turning into a welfare state, meaning people relied too much on government benefits and lost incentive to work. So Reagan's government wanted to still offer welfare to struggling families, but wanted the goal to be to get people back to work and not stay on government benefits long term. So Reagan did reduce income taxes for individuals and businesses, which was a good thing. Labor unions took a hit when federal air traffic controllers went on strike, and the U.S. law forbid federal workers from striking. Well, these air traffic controllers did it anyway. So what did Reagan do? Well, he fired all of them because he was the boss of federal workers, and many unions since that time have lost bargaining power since then due to the reputation hit of the union, of that particular union. What Reagan didn't do was reduce government spending. In fact, it went up to pay for more military during the Cold War with the USSR. So in the 1990s, our federal deficit shrank, which is good, as technology boomed and the government received a large increase in taxes. President Clinton continued to change welfare programs, increased taxes on rich individuals, and passed NAFTA, which we talked about a couple chapters ago. Clinton also passed banking reforms that now brought commercial and investment banking together. Before, government had separated the two. So this turned out to be a really bad thing, which we will talk about in a moment. Banks and companies began to consolidate as they're now together and turned into massive corporations, meaning less competition. So these massive corporations then took on more financial risk and made riskier loans and investments. Despite that, inflation was finally under control and U.S. families had more spending power. Their money went further and they were able to buy more. So in the 90s and 2000s, the U.S. had steady growth, low unemployment, and low inflation, and that's great. But America had a problem with those big corporate banks that now existed after Clinton. Their risky investments and loans did not work out. So in 2007 and 2008, the U.S. had the largest recession since the Great Depression we talked about in the 1920s. And this was primarily caused by the deregulation of the financial industry we talked about when commercial and investment banking were allowed to commingle with corporations. One company could now offer both services. So because of that, banks started to engage in investment banking, stocks and funds, and that included hedge funds. Hedge funds take money from multiple investors, and the bank invests all that money into stocks or other assets. But we all know the stock market itself is very risky. So because of that, banks demanded more home loans to support their investments, to the point where banks were offering interest-only loans to borrowers that had very bad credit, meaning there was a good chance that these borrowers could not pay back their loan. At the same time, property values were going up, and many people bought homes just because they were so cheap to buy and anyone could get a home loan. In 2004, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates. Well, what happened from that? Those risky borrowers could no longer pay their loans because they were too expensive with the interest. Housing prices began to fall as demand for new houses went down. People could no longer afford them. When prices went down, so did the supply. So now homeowners couldn't afford to pay their loans, but they also couldn't sell their houses because demand went down and their house wasn't worth as much as what they paid for it. When banks lost money in their investments, now the bank's assets also went down in value to the point that they could no longer pay their bills or cover their losses on their investments. The Federal Reserve raised rates at the worst possible time, and now everyone was paying for it. When the housing market started to crash, so too did the financial market, since they were now tied together thanks to those deregulations of banks. The stock market then crashed, and the housing market was in terrible shape. Home values tanked, so nobody could sell their house and cover their home loans. Banks were in bad shape and risked closing, but now these banks were massive corporations. If they failed entirely, millions of Americans would be affected. So imagine what would happen if you owned a home and were paying a loan on it, and then the bank you got your loan from just closed up. How fearful would you be of what would happen to your home? So because of those bank deregulations, President Obama faced the following in 2009: a stock market plunge, a frozen credit market, U.S.'s largest banks were about to collapse, home mortgages were defaulting, borrowers could no longer pay their loans, consumer spending dropped, and businesses suffered and unemployment increased. What did the Obama administration do? They went back to Keynesian ideas. When the economy is bad, the government spends. And the U.S. government did just that. It bailed out banks and other failed major businesses to prevent them from closing their doors. They gave them money. The U.S. government bought out all the bad assets the huge banks had invested in, almost $700 billion total, and then also bought stock market shares of those banks to give them cash. The government did sell those shares later. So for the housing market, the U.S. bought $200 billion in stock for mortgage lenders Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, allowing them to return to profitable companies by the year 2012. So the bailouts worked, at least for the companies that the government bailed out. They fixed their issues after the government made new laws that prevented the mistakes from happening again that those corporations made. However, all of that government spending has put America trillions of dollars in debt. The coronavirus pandemic has added to that. The U.S. government also spent billions for the U.S. to recover from that issue. In the early 1900s, government spending was only 4% of our gross domestic product, the total value of our goods and services made in the United States. Today, that percentage is 40% of the United States GDP. So, from that quick history lesson, the United States is currently a capitalist economy with a very heavy dose of government intervention. Today, Americans are split between keeping the government out of industries like health, education, etc., or heavy government regulation. If you follow the 2024 political cycle, you can see two parties that have very different visions of America and how government plays a role in our country. So our case study for Chapter 4 is the International Property Rights Index in 2023. The IPRI takes data from 125 countries, which is about 93% of the world's population. It reviews policies and property rights of each country and gives each country a score in various categories. Then it takes all those categorical scores and provides a final score for each country, with the score being between 0 and 10, 10 being the highest. The index also tries to find relationships between these scores against other factors like gender equality, market competition, how much money flows through the country, how easy it is for people to get around their country, and energy consumption. Over 100 individual organizations help create this index across the world every year. So what is the trend of among the top 5 countries? They are mostly free market societies that promote private ownership of property and free enterprise, meaning there is competition and the government stays out of competition. Prices of products and services are determined by buyers and sellers, not the government. Another commonality between these countries is that they are all politically stable. So despite our American news being mostly negative all the time, our country does not have military takeovers and large violent overthrows of our government that changes our economy. So going back to the USSR from earlier in the chapter, since the Soviet government played such a huge role in their economy, political instability within their government played a huge part in their sinking economy. In the United States, despite our political turmoil, buyers and sellers still set our markets. The bottom 5 countries either do not have free market economies or have had years and decades of political instability and violence that has caused property rights issues and a weak economy. In Haiti, that country has had no elected officials since January of 2023, and right now is being governed by a 9-member council trying to stabilize the country. In Venezuela, it is last in the rankings for a few reasons. One, the country attempted to specialize in oil production and disregarded the rest of their economy to only produce oil. Well, when the price of oil sharply went down in 2014, their economy tanked due to their over-reliance on money coming from oil. In turn, the government could no longer afford their social programs to its citizens, and there have been shortages of basic goods and high inflation. Also for Venezuela, the current government has set price controls on products and tries to put strict controls on their currency. They try to force other countries to exchange their currency at a set price. Well, much like any other product, currency should also be set by buyers and sellers in a free market, not the government. In 2018, the Venezuelan president boycotted other opponents from running against him and is governed as an authoritarian, which means he enforces strict obedience to the government, and citizens lose personal freedoms if they don't do that. Yemen, in second to last place, has been at civil war since the 1990s, and between 2014 and 2019, they had no legislative branch to create laws at all. Currently, there are 2 different sides in Yemen, and they are competing for land and power and continue to negotiate for some type of stable government today. Countries with higher average incomes also scored better than lower income averages. Why? Because free market economies and competition lead to higher production and higher pay. Property tax implies a constraint, which is a restriction to that property right. By virtue, an adjustment to the IPRI for this concept is made to account for these impacts using the data on property taxes. So the IPRI takes property taxes as a negative, and the United States does have property taxes, and they're quite high. And the United States is one of the uh, largest countries with a negative score due to property taxes. So key takeaways from the case study would be property rights do help economies grow. Countries with political instability do hurt property rights, and countries with too much government control also hurt property rights.